What's now? What? No.
I might give it to you. Spend the next hour, 2 hours.
Then
Okay, it should be now. Everybody's great. They're touching. No, we gotta use the mouse. Something that I'm writing.
Okay. Welcome everybody. We're gonna go ahead and get started so we can stay on time. Happy Friday. We're happy to have Dr. John Romig here to present our October Colloquium. Just a quick background, he is an associate professor in the special education department. He actually just started with us this semester, so we're very happy to have him. His research is informed by the need for evidence-based literacy interventions at secondary grade levels and the importance of high-quality teacher training to support students with disabilities. Dr. Romig's research is focused on classroom-based assessment strategies to monitor students' progress in writing and strategies for improving teachers' literacy instruction for students with disability. And specifically, he's looking at the technical properties of curriculum-based measurement, a specific form of classroom-based assessment. Further, he examines the effectiveness of literacy interventions and teacher prep interventions. He primarily uses single case and experimental single case and group designs, regression-based and meta-analytic methods. With his classroom, or excuse me, his expertise in classroom assessment, he contributes to many other research teams. And he's been the PI and co-PI on many grants, so about $2.5 million. So very excited to have him here to talk about his research. So Dr. Romig, you're ready.
Thank you very much. Happy to join you all today and share a little about my work. I'm gonna, if you were here last month, you saw like a one in-depth presentation of one research study, and this is going to be kind of the opposite. I'm gonna give you kind of an overview, and it's gonna be fast and furious, and I'm gonna save room for questions and stuff at the end, but if you want to ask a question while I'm talking, please feel free to stop and answer that. Well, is this going to work? No. All right. So, let's start with that. Okay. So here's the background. I'm going to talk a little about the background because this type it's writing assessment, which you are familiar with, but it's a very different form of writing assessment. And so I want to give you guys a little bit of background, and then we'll get into some of the research that I've done in future directions. So, like Lindsay said in the introduction, I sort of focus on these three circles. And sometimes they're overlapping and sometimes they're not, and sometimes all three of them work together. And we'll talk a little bit about that with the future directions. When I talk about writing assessments, there's lots of different ways that you can use writing assessments. And oftentimes especially when I present to people outside of special education, they get really hung up on how you would use the assessment that I'm going to present to you today to inform instruction. Like it doesn't give me any information that I need to teach or to create a lesson plan or something like that. So I want you to keep this image of a thermometer in your head. When you go to the doctor, they check your temperature, right? It's one of the first things they do. And they are checking for overall health. Like, it's not perfect, right? But it's a pretty good indicator of is this person healthy or not healthy? And if they're not healthy, we're gonna do some more investigating, some more exploring to figure out what do we need to do to get this person healthy again. And so it's not a diagnostic assessment, it's just sort of an overall indicator. Another thing about it is that it's really quick. You can take your temperature very quickly and it's over and you're done. Do I need to do anything for you? Okay. Okay, so that's kind of the framework that you want to be thinking of. All right, so we have in education sort of this tiered model of support. You might call it response to intervention or multi-tiered systems of support. And so we have two types of assessment in this area. So we have universal screening measures, which identify people in this tier 1 level of support who are potentially going to struggle in academics in some way. So it's a screening assessment. You're filtering out people who aren't going to struggle, and you're trying to identify those who may struggle. And then as you go along with the tier 2 and tier 3 levels of support, you're getting more frequent progress monitoring. And so these types of assessments, screening and progress monitoring assessments, are what I'm talking about. And ideally, they will look something like this, where you would have a weekly or monthly assessment of a student, and you would track their progress over the course of a year, and they would have some score. And that score is going to tell us whether or not they're progressing or not progressing. So that's the context. So I'm not looking at this score. I can't tell you yet if a child has a score of 20, what your lesson plan should say. But I can tell you if this child is on track or not on track to reach their goal. Are they healthy or not healthy? It's kind of what we're trying to answer. Oops, wrong way. Okay. So this, you're familiar with typical writing assessments. So what we have here is a rubric from the 6+1 traits, and it's a pretty common writing rubric, I would say. We also have scales, like maybe a holistic writing scale where you just sort of rate someone's writing on a scale of 1 to 5 or something like that, and sort of a holistic rating of their writing. You're familiar with that. You're all professors. You've created rubrics before. An issue with these is that they are not sensitive to growth, or at least small amounts of growth. So if you're thinking about trying to lose weight, you go to the store, you buy a scale, and you come home and you find out that it measures to the nearest tens place. We're gonna do some math here. If your true weight is 204 pounds, what is the scale going to say that you weigh? It measures to the tens place. Someone said 200, right? And you're gonna have to lose 10 pounds so that your true weight is 194 pounds before your scale shows any progress. And at that point, it's going to say you weigh 190 pounds, and you start this whole thing over again, right? Okay, we'll think of it in the context of losing weight. You might change your diet, you might start exercising, you might do lots of stuff and see no progress on the scale for weeks. And you throw your hands up in the air and you say, nothing works, I'm gonna give up, right? So it's a sensitivity issue. And so you can think of this in an academic setting. Students with disabilities, students who are struggling writers, can take months or years to move like a point on one of these rubrics, to go from, you know, promising to developing, or whatever the little categories or levels are on a rubric. And so it's a real problem when you're trying to use those data to say, are these students making any progress? Is what we're doing working or not? So Lynn Fuchs is a researcher in curriculum-based measurement, and she proposed sort of 3 stages of curriculum-based measurement research. And I think it's helpful for kind of categorizing a research agenda in my work in this area. So stage 1 is static data points, just looking at what we typically think of as criterion validity, alternate form reliability, test-retest reliability, that kind of stuff. Stage 2 is looking at data points over time. So thinking of a progress monitoring measure, and how do these data act over time? What are the slopes like? Are they reliable? Are they stable? That sort of thing. And then the last thing is, if we actually use these in classrooms, do students get better? Do their outcomes improve if their instruction is guided by these data? If teachers are looking at these graphs and making decisions based on them? So my work has really focused on stage 1 and 2, and so that'll kind of help you think about what we're talking about today. So we have here is my favorite picture, my wife and I running. I am the struggling writer and she is the advanced writer. In truth, in my defense, she was very much struggling in this race, but she has a real gift for finding the photographers in races and smiling at the right moment, and I don't. And so I have the hurt on my face. All right, so if we were grading this student's spelling, the person on the left, someone be bold and tell me, what score would we give this person? Does this person get credit for this letter, this word that he spelled or not? No, obviously not, right? Okay, does the person on the right get credit for correct spelling of that word? No, right? So in traditional spelling method, traditional scoring, both of these people are getting 0 credit. But you can obviously see that one of them is a much more advanced, more developed writer than the other one is. We're not even sure if those are letters or like what that person wrote on the left. On the right, the person clearly knows the sounds and the letters sound correspondence, and they just mixed up the K and the C, right? Okay, so what curriculum-based measurement tries to do is to give students credit for what they did correctly in their writing. And so I came from Texas, and so this is a requirement of every Texas presentation. You have to have this sentence in there. So what we do here is we count things in the student's writing that they did. So one thing we could count is the number of words written. And so if you look at the sentence on the left, N would not be considered a word because it doesn't have 2 letters. You have to have 2 letters offset by a space to be considered a letter, unless we're talking about I or A. But N is not a word, and so it's not counted as a words written. Words spelled correctly, I used to say it's like a spell checker, but spell checkers have gotten too advanced. It's like a very old school spell checker. If you're around for the early 2000s, that did not consider the context of the word. So all it looked at is this a correctly spelled word, regardless of context. So things like using the right form of there, and there, as long as you spelled it correctly, it doesn't matter if it's used correctly in the sentence or not. Then we get into correct writing sequences, and this is where we actually have more consideration of the context and the rules around spelling. So the first thing is everything capitalized correctly? So you see the downward caret indicates that that's an incorrect sequence. The above caret is the correct sequence. So we're not counting words anymore, we're counting sequences or links between words. So the first one on the left is incorrect because everything is not capitalized. The link from everything to R is incorrect because R is not the right verb for that subject agreement, and so it's incorrect. And unfortunately for that student, it's incorrect on both sides. So because we're counting sequences, both words in a sequence have to be correct. Bigger to in is incorrect because in is not a word, and then into Texas is incorrect for multiple reasons, including the fact that Texas is not capitalized. And then Texas to the end of the sentence is incorrect because Texas was not capitalized. Okay, any questions about how we're getting that score? All right, you guys are a great bunch. You'll notice that the student on the left has a negative score of -6, right? And if you think that's a problem, I would love to answer that and talk about it at the discussion at the end, but you're right, it is a problem. Okay, so this is what the spelling looks like. When you're thinking of curriculum-based measurement in this type of assessment, I typically think of it as a menu. You have your starter, your appetizer, your main course, and then your dessert or whatever, right? So you get to pick from these 3 options. You have the prompt, what are the students writing in response to? And most of the research in this area has looked at story starters. So a story starter is the opening line of a sentence, followed by an ellipsis mark. So it might say like, I was walking down the road all of a sudden, or when all of the sudden, ... and you have to pick up the story and finish it from there. And then there's it's timed writing. So students are typically given a minute to think about a response, and then anywhere from 3 to 10 minutes to actually write and produce their response. They're told not to write, and they're not allowed to write during the thinking time. That's just thinking time. And then the teacher says begin writing, and they begin, and they're told when to stop. And then the scoring procedures, which we've already gone over. So my work is kind of guided by, my work is guided by cognitive load theory. Cognitive load theory is a theory that posits that your brain processing can be thought of similar to an ATM debit card. And so as spending increases on your card, you start getting alerts like slow down your spending, you're running out of funds, low funds alert, right? And then eventually you hit a cap where you have no more money in your debit card and it says decline, right? So you can think about brain processing similarly. It's not perfect analogy, but when you start to increase the cognitive load in your brain, multiple things happening at once, very complex tasks happening at once, your learning process slows down. So you've probably experienced this before, like if you drive with kids in your car and you have loud music on and then a storm starts and rain is happening, and all of a sudden, like you turn down the music, you tell everyone to be quiet because you have to concentrate on driving, right? The complexity of the task increased, and so you had to lower some of the brain processing that was happening in other areas. So when we think about this in the context of writing, these are the things that make up the task that we call writing. So you have goal setting, like what am I going to write about, or who am I writing for, or what do I want to communicate in this writing? The ideas, the words, what kind of vocabulary am I choosing? Am I picking simple words, or am I choosing more complex vocabulary words? Then there's actually the transcription, the physical act of getting the words on the page. How do I spell them? How do I write them? How do I form them or type them, whatever I'm doing? And all of that is constrained by working memory. And so if your working memory and if your cognitive load is very high, you have little working memory to devote to these things. And so if I'm spending a lot of time on spelling, for example, or other mechanical tasks, like what's the right subject verb agreement here? What's the right pronoun antecedent agreement here? What's the right form of this word for this sentence? If I'm spending a lot of time here, I don't have, or here for that matter, I don't have a ton of space left over for the self-regulatory aspects of writing. Like when I get distracted or when things get hard, I don't have the self-regulatory brain processing space to push through that obstacle and to keep working. And so instead I stop or I get distracted. Okay, so let's get into some of the actual work. I learned about curriculum-based measurement as an undergraduate, and then I went to my PhD program, and I was in a meta-analysis course, and I was learning about how to combine effect sizes and that sort of thing. And the professor was talking about how you can combine any kind of effect size. Typically, think of Cohen's D and Hedges G, and I thought to myself, isn't R an effect size? Like, we have all these R correlations. Couldn't I do a meta-analysis with that? And the professor had to think about it for a second, and he said, I think you could. So this was actually a study that I did as a doctoral student. So for all the doctoral students in the room, pay attention in your courses, do good work, and you can publish with them. But what I was curious about is, okay, so if we say that these measures, if this is what we're measuring students' progress with, is this related to any other outcome that we care about? So what we have here are the 4 scoring procedures on the left, and my work is mostly focused on grades 6 through 8. This paper talks about all grade levels, but I'm going to focus on middle school. And these are the average correlations weighted by sample size of other studies that have looked at how was this measure correlated with a state writing test or a commercial writing test. So the test of written language, Stanford 9, the Woodcock-Johnson, any of these standardized writing tests or a state test. And so you'll notice a couple things. One thing is the highest, the strongest criterion validity score is 0.5. And if you are familiar with criterion validity, especially in the area of reading, you might look at that and say like, oh, that's terrible. But this is actually pretty similar to what we find of a lot of other writing assessments. So other writing assessments like the test of written language, which is a commercial, published, normed writing assessment, is going to be right around 0.5, 0.55, somewhere in there for their criterion validity. So this is pretty comparable to what we see in other fields, with other writing assessments. The other thing you'll notice is in the N column, this is the number of studies that have looked at this scoring procedure with students in grades 6 through 8, and there's just not a lot, like 4 to be specific for the correct minus incorrect word sequences procedure. The other thing you'll notice is a pattern that as the scoring procedures get more complex, the criterion validity gets stronger. Right, so the words written is the simplest scoring procedure, you're just counting words. It has the weakest criterion validity. The most complex one is correct minus incorrect word sequences, and it has a criterion validity of 0.5. So that's scoring procedures. We're looking only at scoring procedures in this study. I used the same collection procedures, identified the same studies, but did a different analysis to look at the administration procedures. So this is looking at the story starter or the prompt types. And you'll notice here, so we have a lot of story starter study, I mean, not a lot, but relatively more with 13 story starter studies, but only 3 looking at the picture prompt. And so even though picture prompt looks really promising there with strong criterion validity, I don't have a lot of confidence in those results just because there's only 3 studies that are looking at it. Okay, I think that's all I want to say about this here. And then let's look at duration. So this is how long students are writing. And so for middle school students, there doesn't seem to be a huge difference in the writing duration for criterion validity. So it's all roughly around 0.55 to 0.6, but it doesn't seem to really matter how long they're writing for criterion validity. We'll talk about later why it might matter for some other technical properties. Okay. But some holes in the literature base. So overall, just not a lot of studies were done with secondary grade students. And so you saw some of the numbers for the ends on there, very few studies being done, a great area for a young early career researcher to step into and make his way. The other thing is that specifically students with emotional and behavioral disabilities were, I think they were included in one of the studies that we identified. And so this area, the population of students was really underdeveloped. And it was an area that I was interested in personally because writing could theoretically have a lot of benefits for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. And so including them is an important part of that research agenda. So the first thing we did is try to fill this hole with secondary students broadly. And so this was a study published in Assessing Writing. It actually just came out last fall, I think, or no, last spring. So we're looking at alternate form reliability of curriculum-based measures, criterion validity, using the test of written language as a criterion measure. And then one of the things that had not been answered in research previously is, does it matter how close you are to the criterion assessment in time? So as you get closer to the criterion assessment, do those correlations get stronger versus when they're farther away? Yeah.
Next question, for the uninitiated alternate form.
Yeah. So alternate form reliability basically means we're getting the same assessments, but a different form of the assessment. So in the context of this study, they're writing different story starters. So it's the same assessment, but a different form of it. So it's sometimes if you're looking at the Woodcock-Johnson test, they have like Form A and Form B. Most published commercial assessments like that, normed assessments, will have 2 forms at best. Like that's the most forms. The nice thing about this assessment, and we'll talk about it when we get to stage 2 research, is that you can create almost an unlimited number of forms. So you can repeatedly give them to students without them ever seeing the same one twice. Good question. So this is your 89 8th grade students, and they're from a single suburban middle school. You can see some of the numbers here will indicate that this school is a little bit, not a little bit, but more affluent than the average school. And so this was in a college town in the mid-Atlantic. I'll let you all take a guess which one it was. And then this is the school's population. If you're familiar with writing performance, you'll notice that the histogram of participant scores on the writing assessment is very heavily weighted to the right. And so typically we would not see that. It would almost be the reverse. So typically students would be very low performing in writing. And this was the opposite. So something to keep in mind as we look at the context for these results. So students responded to 1 story starter per week for 11 weeks. I was the researcher. This is also important context for the study. I was the one who was administering the assessments. So I would walk into the teacher's school at when the bell, or her classroom when the bell rang. I would pass out the papers to students, I would time them, I would collect them, put them in my folder and leave. So students saw all that. So they knew that I was leaving with their papers and not handing them to their teacher or something like that. Their teacher wasn't collecting them. So if you're a critical thinker, ask a question about that in the discussion as well. The students wrote for 7 minutes and they were scored for all 4 of these scoring procedures that you've seen so far. And then they completed the test of written language, spontaneous writing task. So the test of written language has lots of different subtests. They have spelling and sentence combination and things like that. But specifically, there's a section of the test where students write a story. They have 5 minutes to look at a picture. The picture is of, it looks like a person taking driving school and they hit a fire hydrant. And so there's a dog nearby. And so they're supposed to write about this scene in the picture. And then you score it 2 different ways. Once for contextual conventions. And so these are typically things we think of as the mechanics of writing. So did they, use the a and and correctly? Did they have how many words do they have with 7 letters in it and that sort of thing? And then we have story composition, which is more like what we might think of as the fun stuff or the quality stuff about writing. Like, did they have a good hook or opening that enticed you into the reading and that sort of thing? Those 2 scores are combined to give you a spontaneous writing sub score. So there's a lot of results to look at here. We're going to go through them quickly. I'm not going to make you look at all these numbers, but what you'll see is overall, these criterion validity quotients are lower than what I reported in the meta-analysis by a pretty significant margin. So we would have expected this to be around 0.3, and you only see a couple getting to 0.3 at the very end of the study. A lot of them are in the 0.2 and even in the teens. So you can interpret this like a correlation. If you divide, it is a correlation. So if you divide it in half, you can explain that much of the variance in the criterion measure. So if you're looking at like 19, or let's do something that's easier to divide. If you look at 30, that means that 15% of your score, of the variance in your score on the criterion measure can be explained by this measure. That's really not a lot. And so there's a lot of statistically significant results in here, but that just speaks to how easy it is to get statistically significant results with correlations. If you look at how much of the student's performance we're actually explaining on the criterion measure, it's pretty little. And we see the same pattern where as the scoring procedures get more complex, the criterion validity coefficients get stronger, but they're still pretty significantly below what I reported in the meta-analysis. So we'll breeze through these. This one here, you'll remember, was around 0.5 for middle school students, and nothing approaches 0.5 in this study. So pretty far below what had been found by other researchers in other contexts. Okay, so this is a current project that I'm working on. And so when you think of a screening assessment, you're trying to identify struggling writers and non-struggling writers. Like, we want to be able to, you're classifying people. You either are struggling or you're not struggling. It's a dichotomous thing. So your score on curriculum-based measurement is continuous, right? So you can, from 0 to as many numbers as or as many words as you want to write, it's a continuous variable, and we dichotomize it by saying you either are at risk or not at risk. And I wanted to see if we're using these for screening measures, is it actually an accurate classifying measure? So there's 4 statistics that we look at here: sensitivity and specificity, predictive positive power, and negative predictive power. I think it's easier to see these visually. So if we have our screening assessment scores, think of this as an XY axis. We all passed 4th grade, and so you can see what we have here. We have a screening assessment score and your outcome assessment. So state tests, commercial tests, whatever you're using. You end up with this quadrant that has 4 sections to it. So if you're to the left of this score, we're saying you are at risk for writing failure. If you're to the right, you are not at risk for writing failure, right? So that's pretty simple. Left, at risk; right, not at risk. But then when you take the actual, the high stakes state test, we actually see who did pass if they're above this line, and who did not pass if they're below this line. And so what you end up with is people who are truly positive for risk. Being positive for risk is a bad thing. So if you're positive for risk, that means that the screening measure said you were at risk. And if you're truly positive, that means you actually failed the end of your assessment. If you are a true negative, the screening measure said you were not at risk, and you were truly not at risk because you passed the end of your assessment. We look at false negatives. These are people who the screening assessment said were fine, said you're not at risk, you're above the threshold, but then when they took the end of your test, they failed. So they were false negatives. These are kids that we would consider to be falling through the cracks. They're the ones that we really want to limit, because the whole point of this process is to identify them. We want to limit these people. And these people up here are false positives. They're people who scored to the left of the cut point. So they were identified as being at risk, but they passed the end of your assessment. And so they weren't actually at risk. And so you might think of them, this sounds negative to say about kids, but they're a drain on resources. So they're taking up seats, they're using curriculum, they're taking teacher hours that could be used by other students and don't need to be used for them. All right, so here's what some of the data look like in the actual study. And I'll show you what the numbers look like. There's 220 results, we're not going to go through all of them. But these are the averages. So on average, the measures had very strong negative predictive power. So if the measure said that you were negative for risk, you were not at risk, 90% of those students actually passed the test, which is good, that's great. It has very low positive predictive power. In other words, if it said you were positive for risk, there was only a 1 in 4 chance that you actually failed the test. In other words, there's a lot of students who are being identified and draining resources of the school because they were identified incorrectly as being at risk. So you can kind of see it visually up here, what those numbers look like. Okay, so we'll put a pause on that. So the screening measures, curriculum-based measurement can be used as a screening measure, but there's lots of other things you can use as a screening measure, because screening measures are given once a year, right? Well, some schools are doing them 2 or 3 times a year now, but under the original conception, the idea was you screen students at the beginning of the year, once a year, identify who's struggling and proceeds with the rest of the year. Even if you're doing it 3 times a year, you can still use a longer, more robust assessment than something that takes 7 minutes. If you're doing a progress monitoring assessment that is given weekly, it has to be shorter than the test of written language. Test of written language takes 1 hour to 2 hours to administer. We can't be doing that every week. And so the real potential for curriculum-based measurement, in my mind, is as a progress monitoring measure, which leads you to stage 2 research and thinking about the slopes of data over time, and not just single data points in time. So this is this study, and as soon as we do it, my colleague is Amanda Olson. She's a professor at the University of Missouri, and as soon as she did the descriptive statistics and looked at this graph, she's not a CBM researcher, so she doesn't actually know what she's looking at. I just have to like tell her what to do, and she puts it into R. As soon as she gave me this graph, I said, uh-oh, that's a problem. Because everything about curriculum-based measurement that we assume is that better or more means better. So if you read more words, you're a better reader. If you write more words, you're a better writer. And I showed you in that progress monitoring graph very early on, we want the graphs going up. And you don't have to be a single case researcher to look at this and know these lines are all going down, right? The trend over time is declining. And so that was a problem. So one of the things that we wanted to know is, are these slopes reliable? So is students' performance over time a reliable indicator of their progress? And so we did this in 2 ways. One way is we split the students' data into 2 slopes. One slope was even weeks, one slope was odd weeks. And we correlated these 2 slopes to each other. So how well did your even week performance correlate to your odd week performance? And you can see here that for the most complex scoring procedures, it was okay, an okay predictor, but not great, not super strong reliable. The other way that we did it is we compared, we started with weeks 1 through 3 over here. And each week we added a week, so weeks 1 through 3, 1 through 4, 5, and so on, compared to your full data set. So could 3 weeks of data predict the full data set? And when did you get to a point where we felt confident in the reliability? And so if you look at week 8, once you get to week 8, that's pretty strong reliability, 0.7. But if you're a critical listener in the room, you might say, well, yeah, but at that point, you're basically using 80% of the data to predict 100% of the data. And that's a good point to bring up. Here we're looking at stability, in other terms, how volatile are students' data. And again, once you get to around 7 or 8 weeks of data collection, they get to a point where they're pretty stable, and you're able to make decisions more effectively. So you wouldn't want to make decisions with these data instructionally until you collected 7 to 8 to 9 weeks of data. This is not something that we're going to start in August, and by September, we're already moving kids around and changing up what they're doing. You need to collect at least 8 weeks of data before you can start making decisions. The last question that I wanted to know is, were these things sensitive to growth in typical contexts? So there was no intervention. We weren't, giving a writing intervention or anything like that. We just wanted to know, with typical writing instruction that these students received, are they sensitive to growth? And that's why I said that the descriptive statistics were such a problem, because we were defining growth as more and getting better, and they were actually declining. And so that was not statistically different from 0. And so we did not say that they were sensitive to growth in this study. So overall, if you look at the criterion validity, it was comparable to other writing assessments. It's not, no one's going to throw a parade for it. It wasn't that strong, but when you consider it in the context of writing assessments, it's strong enough, we'll say. And then we have really limited research looking at slopes for middle school students. To my knowledge, this is the only study that has looked at slopes over a period of time like that. Some studies will look at sensitivity to growth over like 3 points in time in the year with middle school students. But as far as like week to week, the performance of slopes with students from middle school, which is how we intend to use these data, I don't know of any other study that's done that. And then we have some concerns, but so I don't know if you guys are familiar with beige flags. You guys see these on TikTok, what a beige flag is? Okay, it's not a red flag, it's not a whatever, it's a beige flag. So I consider a lot of my work to be beige flags. So it's concerning, but the sample issues really kind of limit how strong you can raise the flags, if that makes sense. There's a lot of ways that I can critique this sample, and you probably could as well, that weaken some of the claims that can be made. So I don't want to throw out curriculum-based measurement altogether and say, this is garbage, we can't use it anymore. But I think there's definitely enough cause for concern at the middle school level that we need to say, is this working? Can it work? How should it work? That sort of thing. So the future, what does the great beyond look like? I think there's a lot of potential for AI in this area. It's because of the strict rule-based nature of the scoring procedures. I think you could train a lot of computers to do this stuff on its own. I do think that there is another question to ask is, do you lose something if teachers aren't looking at and scoring their students' data? Or another way of thinking about it is there an added benefit to a teacher looking at the data themselves and scoring these and doing sort of a real fine-grained analysis of their students' writing? And so my work, what I want to think about is, what does informing instruction with these tools look like? And I told you that typically we think of this as being you're either healthy or not healthy, like a two-step, a two-pronged decision. What I would like to think about it is more like informing how we teach you writing, because if you've been a middle school writing teacher, you know who the struggling students are in writing, because they've been struggling for a very long time by the time they get to you, and it's easy to find them because it's all of them, right? So it's, when you look at like national assessments of writing and that sort of thing, about 75% of students are below grade level. 75, like 3 in 4 students are below grade level in national assessments of writing performance at the middle school level. So reading thinks that they're bad, but we're worse in writing. So it's really bad. And so there really doesn't even need to be so much emphasis on like week to week data collection. It really needs to be more informed by you're struggling and you need to be in an intensive reading program for a long period of time. We'll worry about changing it after a while, but we're not going to be changing it week to week like we do in some other contexts. And so my idea, this is what I want to study, what I want to work on for the next 5 years, is to develop targets or categories. So if I give you a writing prompt, this happens to me a lot, where I ask students to write something and they will think of a story starter, they'll finish the sentence and they're done, right? So like I was walking down the road, but all of a sudden, you know, a tree branch fell in front of me, period, and I'm gonna sit here for 6 more minutes and write nothing, right? And so what I would say is that student needs help with brainstorming, outlining, prompt analysis. They might need incentives or reinforcement to increase their writing production. But I'm going to treat them differently than a student who writes 150 words on the page, but has tons of errors or very simple vocabulary or things like that, right? And so the idea is to say not just like, are you healthy or not healthy, but actually what type of instruction are you going to benefit from the most? And so you might think of like small groups in reading or something like that, where you're kind of working on more targeted skills with students. And so this would be sort of my idea for like targeted writing groups at the middle school level, where students are placed into groups based on these scores and then receive instruction that's commensurate with their ability in that area. So thank you all for listening. And if you have, I forgot to update my email address. I used to be a professor at UTA.
Why don't you do that now?
Yeah, I'll do that now. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them now. Yes.
I'm wondering, thank you for your presentation, but I'm wondering what you attribute the declining scores over time to, and I'm wondering. My immediate thought is around what do the prompts look like, and then do they feel like they have a purpose for writing?
Yeah.
And if the teacher doesn't take it up, and if a researcher is taking it up, then am I even gonna get a grade? Like, I don't know how middle schoolers think, but I'm just wondering what you attribute this decline to.
So it could be, I think it could be all those things. It could be some combination of them. I think the biggest part is like you can see at the beginning, they kind of get better. And so I think 2 things are going on here. One is we know from observational studies, survey studies of teachers' writing practice, students actually get very little time to actually write in classrooms. And so sometimes the 7 minutes of writing that they're doing for me is the most writing that they've gotten in a while in class. And so I think at the beginning, you actually see some improvement in their performance, because at first it was hard or it was new or whatever, but then they improved after a few practices. But I think around after 4 or 5 weeks, they're like, oh, all right, this was fun for a while. It's not new anymore. And to your point, this guy's just taking them with him. It's not, my teacher's not using these. It's not a grade for anything. I'm never seeing these again. And they kind of drop off after that.
What's the prompt look like?
So it's a story starter.
It's different every time?
Yeah, it's different every time. So these were developed, Intervention Central. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that website, but it's like a practitioner focused website that has a lot of resources for teachers to progress monitor students' academics and behavior. And they have a bank of writing prompts. And so these are just randomly drawn from that pool of prompts.
So there's no kind of, wouldn't be like like maybe it was a story.
They're all
writing.
stories.
They're all story,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. But that's a great point to talk about the future. So in this conception I have of trying to target kids' intervention, most research has been narrative focused. It's even the picture prompts are prompting students to look at a picture and write a story about it. But if you look at most instruction at the middle school level, it is not narrative focused. And so I would like, part of my current projects that I'm working on are developing writing prompts in collaboration with teachers that are about the skills that they are teaching. And so I want it to be connected to that face validity for the teachers to be related to what they're doing. Yes,
Question, can you go back to the slide where you talk about how you count errors?
count errors, yeah.
Yeah, the one with the carrots, the up and down carrots, because it's a similar, like in applied linguistics, when we're looking at like accuracy versus fluency of multilingual writers, we use kind of some similar measures. But one thing that always strikes me, both in my field and also how you explained this, is it seems like errors are getting counted multiple times.
Yeah.
And so how, like, but also correct thing, like, I've always, it's not my area of research within applied linguistics, but I've always had a little bit of trouble with like the accuracy measures because of the way things get counted. So it's not, if you make an error, it's not just one error, because you're looking at like chunks of
Yeah.
stuff. Like it's counted here, but it's also counted
Right.
here. So like
Yeah.
even if something is juxtaposed to something correct, it's still an error.
Yeah.
So can you talk through a little bit about how that may affect some of the scoring when you look at those types of things within your work specifically?
Yeah, so that's a good point. The flip side is that when you do something correctly, it also gets.
That's
counted
true.
twice,
Yeah, that's true.
Right.
Right.
I will say, it does end up being a real problem that if the student had just sat there and done nothing, he could have gotten a better score than if he
Yeah.
wrote the sentence, right?
Yeah.
So negative scores are bad, right?
Correct word sequence is giving him so much.
Yeah, so if you write, but have a ton of errors in your writing, you actually end up with a worse score, right?
Right, right.
And so, like, if you look at all the research that I've done in middle school writing, this procedure is by far the most technically sound.
Mhm.
But if I were talking to teachers and saying like, what should you use? My question would be like, if you're struggling with if you're not struggling with that, if a student is struggling, who is an English language learner who makes a lot of errors in their writing, or if they're a very low performing student in writing with a disability or something like that, and they're gonna make a lot of errors, I wouldn't use that one. I would go to the one above it, which is correct word sequences, and just don't subtract incorrect writing sequences from it. Because it's still pretty technically solid, but you're not gonna end up with this problem where you end up with worse scores for writing.
Okay, can you, I think the one slide before also had the two words of
Yep,
cat.
yep.
Can you look at those again? So I don't know if it's like that first one where you said you wouldn't give credit, I actually see. Like the letter shapes are starting to get there, like I think it's better than not,
Yep.
so like I kind of see the K like has that little edge, it kind of looks like an A, the T is like partly there. Like how subjective is that type of scoring? Because I would have probably given some credit to the one on the left as well. But maybe that's my artistic mind.
No.
I don't know.
So I didn't talk about spelling really in depth today, but they would actually look at correct letter sequences when you're talking about spelling.
Okay.
And so that's actually where I think it is helpful to do the sequences, like you were asking about double counting stuff. Because like, even if you thought that this was the beginnings of an A,
Mm.
I wouldn't look at that and say it's a K. Like, to me, it's almost an O or a U.
But on the right, and if the child said
This one here?
C, yeah, so like the one thing about like preschool or kindergarten, you could, and the child said that's C. Then some inventories give credit for the partial, for that,
Right.
but being in the wrong sequence, so they give
Okay.
some credit, so some partial credit is given also for the sounds.
So the reason why the sequence is important is because it's important if the student hears the, in special ed, the way that we think about reading instruction is like, are they hearing the sound connection to the letters? So do you, not just do you know that there's a C in this word, but did you hear that it was at the beginning of the word, right? So it's not just, like if they had, TCA, that's actually less spelling development to me than if someone has KAT. Because they know all the sounds over there, even if they got the letters right over here, but in the wrong sequence, the sound sequence matters in that letter. Yeah,
Just to play devil's advocate.
yeah,
Right,
sure.
so part of what we're teaching kids is directionality, right? We
Yeah.
write from left to right in English. Do you watch them? Did they write? Could you give them credit if they wrote C first and then went over here and wrote A, right? So they are sort of technically in the sequence, but they're not writing in our traditional left to right because that's not a
So
concept.
theoretically, you could. The nice thing about these assessments is that they can be group administered. So if I'm giving them to a whole class,
Yeah,
then I don't see
Yeah.
what they're doing, but
I think the age of the child is also, or the
Yes,
development of the
yes.
child, like this really early in development versus what you were
yeah.
sharing
yeah,
middle schooler. So if a middle schooler
Yes.
produces, I would do it very differently than a kindergartner
Yes, right, yeah,
or preschooler.
yes.
Alright, so I noticed your correlation statistic model.
Mhm.
And I noticed one specific example group, their correlation interval is quite narrow.
Mhm.
As compared to the other.
In the
example group.
meta-analysis or?
Yeah, so the
Okay.
differences between the higher correlation interval and the lower correlation interval, the other group would like all more homogeneous. But one specific group, I think that should for the second one,
Mhm.
yeah. So the differences is quite narrow. So how does this narrow correlation indicate?
I think it's difficult to make a lot of strong claims about any of these because it's based on only a handful of studies. So the narrowness is simply reflecting that the 4 studies that looked at curriculum, or correct minus incorrect word sequences were all pretty close to 0.5. The 5 studies that looked at words spelled correctly, or 4 studies just had more spread in their data and that they reported. But it's really based on 4 studies, like it's literally 4 studies that reported these things. And so there's just not a lot that I would take, especially at the confidence interval level for these.
So do you think this specific example will affect the final prediction?
Say it again.
Do you think this specific the example group will affect your final prediction? So you need to make a prediction based on this model, right? So if you have one specific correlation interval, it's quite narrow compared to the other group that is more homogeneous. So how do you, I'm just curious, do you think this should be considered as outlier to be excluded? Or you need to add more predictors?
So there's no predictors in this. It's just correlation. It's not regression. It's just a correlation of like, you have this assessment on this
Yes.
score, so there's no predictors in the model. It's just 2 variables correlated to each other. Does that help? Okay.
You go to the graph that expresses your confusion matrix, the
Yep.
classifications. The actual graph, though. Yeah. Yeah, can you do the one that has the descriptors for the 4 categories? Yeah. Okay, so I love, I like how you laid out the work because you have like studies where you're kind of, assessing the performance of assessments relative to itself.
Mhm.
And then a study where you're assessing the performance of the assessment relative to some benchmark study. Here you said it was a high stakes state. assessment. That's just one assessment.
Yeah.
Do you think at all about the properties of that assessment? The weight
Sure.
that you give it by making it the benchmark assessment, the possibility that measuring it against several assessments might matter.
Yeah.
Does that factor into how you think about these results?
Yes, so really, we need a lot more people join the team doing this with other writing assessments, right? So you could add in the test of written language as another measure. You could do it across multiple states to see if other state assessments perform similarly. Ultimately, yes, we can criticize all the state assessments and find a lot of flaws in them, but ultimately that's what schools care about, is being able to identify students who are going to struggle on that thing. And so I can't do anything about the state tests, but I can see how well we're able to predict them, if that makes sense. Another way of thinking about a similar issue is, okay, so this is one assessment predicting one other assessment, but what if we had multiple screeners? So Chris Schatzsnyder and his doctoral student, Allison White, have done some work on this area in reading, where they look at like if you fail 3 screening assessments, or like a gated process where you fail the first one and then you take the second one and you fail that one. Or we combine your scores, or like there are all different ways of looking at multiple screening assessments to say, can we increase the accuracy of these decisions we're making with multiple screeners as opposed to just one?
Then if you go back to the slide with the 2 actual examples of the individual
Yep.
word spellings. I just wanted to see which one.
Oh. Take it off. Any other questions?
You created the force, the negative force and the positive force. I'm just curious, how could you set up a threshold to make a decision about each scenario?
How would I make a decision about this
What's the
scenario?
cutoff? What's the cutoff?
Oh, yeah, so that's another thing you can manipulate, all right, so. I chose an arbitrary barrier of the 25th percentile. But the paper also looks at the 20th percentile and the 15th percentile, so you can move that line. Again, we're taking continuous data and dichotomizing it. So this line right here is really arbitrary. If you want to say we want no kids to fall through the cracks, you can move this line way up here. But then you're gonna have a ton of students in this false positive area that don't need intervention.
So both the horizontal and the vertical line, both of them is the cutoff.
So like, I can't do anything about this line. This is what the state says is the passing or failing score, right? I can do a lot with this line. I can move it up and down, and schools make decisions about who are we going to say is at risk on this screening assessment, right? And so if they want to say the 50th percentile, anyone below that is at risk, that's fine. We're gonna have a bunch of people in this false negative area or false positive area. That makes sense? Yep. Anybody else? Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate you being here. Our next speaker will be Dr. Asha. I'm gonna speak. Oh, yeah, hi. Did you know that?
I was gonna
Say your last name for me.